So you want to use domain-driven design, but why? What problems does it solve? Do you have those problems? Well, I reached out to Paul Rayner so we could talk about the problems it solves, different ways of uncovering complexities, processes, boundaries, and a lot more. Here's a bunch of his great insights into domain-driven design. And if you're unfamiliar with Paul, Paul's really knowledgeable about domain-driven design, event storming. He's a developer, a consultant, a coach, a conference speaker, as well as the founder of the Explore DDD Conference. I want to thank EventStore for sponsoring this video. EventStoreDB is a new category of operational database built for event sourcing, CQRS, and event-driven microservices. For more on EventStoreDB, check out the link in the description. When people are getting into domain-driven design, I think there's just a lot of content out there, including my own, which doesn't help that they're like small bite-sized samples of little things. And I get it's kind of hard to see the big picture. But I always go back to kind of why. Like, why are people interested in it? For whatever the reason, but where does domain-driven design fit in? And how does that actually fit into software design?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's usually one of the questions I lead off with when I'm teaching domain-driven design. And the way that I like to explain it, and this really comes from Eric Evans and from the Blue Book as well, is that we're kind of dealing with two broadly different types of complexity when we're writing software, when we're crafting software solutions. There's the technical complexity, which is what we bring to the table in terms of the solution, whether that's Ruby on Rails or event sourcing, some kind of the frameworks and things like that, and how we conceive of the solution. But then there's the inherent business complexity of the problems that we're trying to solve, which is the business rules, the business processes, how people actually do their work. And that's really the domain in domain-driven design. And so when we talk about that domain complexity, there's so many materials out there in our industry that are focused on the technical complexity, tools, frameworks. We're pretty well covered with that. And what domain-driven design, or DDD, is really meant to be focusing on is helping you get that domain complexity under control, right? So if you have complex business rules, complex business processes, or some of the clients I work with are, deploying currency transactions across different nations, right, with different currency rules. And so how do you handle the inherent complexity in dealing with all the regulatory requirements, in maybe a financial domain, or, just the complexity around like scheduling people. A lot of processes seem very simple until you actually dig into them. And then it's like, oh, wow, there's actually a lot going on here. And so DDD is really about how do we tackle that inherent domain complexity, the complexity of the business rules and the business processes, the way people are going to want to use the software. All of that is really where DDD tends to be. That's the sweet spot for that. And I should add as well, tools for strategic design in terms of identifying where that complexity is and whether or not you should go after it.
I always say context is king. I think it plays such an important role on how you're designing your system, your boundaries. So that's what I asked Paul.
Well, I think it's critical in all of this. The key idea in domain-driven design is when you have a lot of domain complexity, then you need to be developing a conceptual model of that complexity. And part of an important part of that is developing a language to express that complexity, some of which will come from the business and some of which you have to develop on your own. And it's that language and that culture, that whatever part of the business you're working in, that gives that language its meaning. So in the examples I use when I teach, I talk about years and years ago, I worked on an extended warranty system. And from the perspective of warranty administration, a warranty is a very rich concept, but a claim is really just something that's related to a warranty. But once you get into claims processing or claims benefit management, now a claim is a very rich concept, and a contract is really something that just anchors a set of claims. And then once you get into accounts payable or finances, claim is just money going out the door. And each of those different business contexts all use the word claim, but it means different things. So paying attention to what context you're in. When I'm teaching it, I'll often use the example like, I lived in Detroit for a while, but when we cross over the Ambassador Bridge into Ontario, well, the context has just shifted, right? The speed limits, we're in a different system now in terms of the way things are measured. And if you're not aware of that, you'll get pulled over for speeding, right? Depending on which way you go. Yeah. And in software, that's not always obvious, right? Like when you open a project and you look at it, then you have to kind of figure out what language are we speaking, what do these terms mean, and that may be a fairly accurate description of the way people talk about in the business, or it might be quite disconnected from that. And so context is a key part of what does this thing mean? What is a claim?
If you're enjoying this conversation with Paul, I highly, highly recommend checking out the Explore DDD Conference. It is easily one of the best conferences I've attended. They're not sponsoring this video. I just wanted to mention it because I loved the conference the last I attended, and I can't wait to attend again in March 2024. I asked Paul about the conference, and here were some of his thoughts.
We really try to optimize the conference for that collaboration and the hallway track. Yeah. So we will have multiple tracks of hands-on sessions for the first time this coming conference. So we're really doubling down on allowing people to actually try these techniques out in hands-on sessions and be able to really, it's a type of conference where the idea is everyone comes along and participates. It's not just coming, some people just want to come and attend the talks, that's fine. But for the people that really want to meet other people and learn and experience the hallway track in a deeper way, this is that type of conference for them.
You mentioned before this, I want to continue that, it's just knowing kind of business processes, those content, like what's important, how you find out where complexity lies. Like I'm just going to throw out, you're probably assuming you're talking about event storming there. Maybe not, but how do you find where the complexity lies, where the value is, maybe?
Right. Yeah, well, what's interesting to me about domain-driven design is that, when I learned it, when I read Eric's book, sort of 2007, 2008, and tried applying that on the extended warranty project, I was really sort of applying that at the code level in terms of, what is an entity, what is a value object, that type of thing, and didn't really focus much on the strategic side of things. And when I actually attended Eric's class and then was mentored by him to teach domain-driven design, I really started to see the importance of the strategic side of things, that you don't want to be over-investing in areas that you don't need to. And so, back then I was drawing UML diagrams, right? And I still do from time to time. Like what I'm trying to model is more of a structural thing. I might draw a class diagram or an instance diagram, or if I'm working primarily with developers, we might draw a sequence diagram or a flow diagram or something like that. And then in terms of strategic design, I looked around for tools that could help me understand that. And there was a tool called the Purpose Alignment Model that was available. And so I tend to use that as a way of explaining to people the difference between generic versus supporting versus core domains to help people understand some of that. But what I was getting at with is like the techniques and tools that are used in the domain-driven design community have evolved and changed, and people are always experimenting with new techniques. So when Alberto Brandolini introduced event storming, that was something that I thought, finally, here's a tool that has a very easy on-ramp for people that aren't technical, because it's just laying out a business process using sticky notes. And what's nice about that is that it nicely represents the process in all its chaotic glory, right? It allows us to identify where potential boundaries are in a process. And then when it comes to implementation, if we're working in a system that has an event-driven architecture or more of an event kind of basis, then it's a very natural transition into that I wouldn't get with like a class diagram or something like that. So I like that a technique like event storming allows me to model the behavior of the system first and sort of think about it that way at a variety of levels versus diving straight to structure and persistence, right? Which is where I would often get hung up with people. So event storming is just one technique. I've seen a lot of people experimenting with business model canvases, with Wardley mapping. There's a lot of really great innovative work that people are doing that's exciting in terms of different ways of approaching modeling a business domain. And domain storytelling is another one that I'm a fan of people using. So yeah, so there's a lot of tools and techniques out there that people are using, and I think that's great.
So to kind of continue with that too is, regardless of where, I guess, what your core domain is, or exposing it, or really understanding what it is, the benefit as well, right, is like just kind of what you alluded to, is knowing where the value is for what you're applying where. But once you get kind of by that, I guess, higher level strategic, and then it actually is time to start writing code. Where's the how do you feel like the translation of, because I always say a lot of people new to DDD, like you mentioned, like myself, I think you're alluding to yourself at the very beginning, immediately kind of started jumping into, okay, there's these set of patterns, I'm looking at entities, value objects, kind of data structures. From the translation from, okay, this is what I think this looks like, to now I actually start coding it, how do you feel like that works, or some of the hang-ups people have?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of challenges with that. So I think that a lot of people that, and I was like this, that are new to domain-driven design tend to over-focus on the building block patterns and get hung up on repository and not so much value objects, but I mean, the aggregate pattern has probably had way too much press over the last decade, right? And there's still talks, people are still pitching talks on, let's define what an aggregate is. And then you've got people on the event sourcing side that are more like, well, we don't need aggregates, we just have event streams and all of that. I think it's this kind of catch-22 situation, I think, of people want to see how do you implement this stuff, and they need to see how do you implement this stuff. And that's always going to be dependent on the language and frameworks and an approach that their team is adopting, right? So if they're using an MVC framework, that's going to shape how they do things. And the patterns are going to look a little different if they're using, say, MVC plus active record for persistence versus MVC plus entity framework with, kind of built-in repositories and that type of thing. So I think it's really important that there are a lot of examples out there of potential ways of how to do this. But the trap of that, I think, is that then people think that is what this is about, right? I remember, when was it? Like over 10 years ago, I was learning Ruby. I'd been working in Java and C# for a long time, and I wanted to learn Ruby. So I thought, well, I'll take there was like a domain-driven design sample application based on the cargo shipping, container shipping examples in Eric's book that had been written in Java and then had been ported to C#. And I thought, well, I'll learn Ruby by implementing this in Ruby, and I'll see if I can do it with Ruby on Rails. And it very quickly, I started having to make choices about, okay, well, how am I going to do this in terms of the database persistence, and how do I adapt this to model view controller, and where do I put things, and like, where are the domain classes, like, where's the cargo object going, right? Because is it an active record model, or is it something else, right? Do I kind of work with the framework, or do I have to kind of work a little bit around the framework? And I think these are the challenges that can make it tricky for people, is that some implementation are going to be more with the grain of these building block patterns, and some you're going to have to get a little bit more creative with them. And there are always trade-offs with these things. And to me, the real importance is, like, that's all really important in terms of how we implement it, but do we actually understand what we're modeling, right? Do we actually understand the business problems and what what those concepts are and the language that we're speaking, so that we can translate that effectively into the code and reflect it that way. So I think it can be a real challenge for people in terms of the implementation side of things. There's so many more good resources now, like Vaughan Vernon's Implementing Domain-Driven Design. There's, Scott Millett and Nick Tune's book. There's Scott Voloskin's book on functional, So there's a lot of great resources out there that were not there 10 years ago when I was more than 10 years ago when I was trying to figure this stuff out. So I think there's a bit of an embarrassment of riches in terms of, guidance for implementing this. The challenge, I think, like I said, is just realizing that that's the implementation of something that is more of a conceptual thing in terms of how do we understand the domain, the business process, the rules.
The thing that I said this before in a video, and I kind of ragged a little bit on kind of sample reference applications, because I think the, like, in a vacuum, I think generally, because they don't give enough context, and usually they're simple enough so that you can understand, like, you're not going to go through a massive sample application and have all this domain complexity that you wouldn't understand to begin with. So it's really challenging. I don't have a problem with reference or sample applications, so as long as you realize they're just, like, really slimmed down, built so that you can understand them easily in some of the patterns, but they don't necessarily show why, like, whether that is even appropriate.
Right.
So you got to take all of it with a little bit
challenge.
And that, I think, is a little bit of a slippery slope when people don't really look at it like, oh, like, this is just illustrating this, and this might not really be a good use case for doing X.
I think it's the difference between, it's meant to be descriptive in terms of here's a possible example of this, that where the assumption is that the domain is complex enough to warrant it, but people might look at it and say, oh, this is prescriptive, right? In that this is the way that you're supposed to do it, regardless of the complexity. And that's where I think you can get yourself into trouble.
Yeah, and I think from some of the comments I get on YouTube and elsewhere, I think for the most part, it's because people don't, like, they want to just do a good job, and they want to do things, quote unquote, right? So the prescriptive aspect of it is like, okay, I just want to do this the right way. Some stuff's a little gray to me. I've been watching all these 10-minute videos like mine, and they don't clear the whole picture. So it's like, I just want to do something right. So I don't think it's, people want to do the right thing or something good. Like, they want to be on the right path. It's just sometimes that, like I said, I think just looking at certain patterns and applying them without really understanding that reference or sample isn't really the best indicator of it.
Right. Well, the whole thing with the pattern language is that patterns only have value in a context, right? So the idea with a pattern is that there's a certain problem type that seems to, when you apply a certain type of solution, go better for you. And so let's say that that problem type, that category of problem, seems to do better when you apply this pattern to it. But when you try to work backwards and say, I have this pattern and I'm not really sure if it works with the problem, but I'm just going to apply it anyway, that's, I think, where you can run into trouble, right? So just being aware of that.
So the kind of one of the last things I want to touch on, more in a bigger scheme, is when you're working with, say, an organization that's bigger, that has multiple teams, and what your experience has been with that in terms of just, having multi-teams designing, interacting, maybe they're only dealing with kind of their own boundaries, how that works.
Yeah. Well, you mean in terms of how would I approach that if I was coming in to try and help them? Yeah. What I've tended to do in recent years is lead off with some kind of big picture event storming exercise where we have representatives from each team, and we try to model out if we're at kind of a 30,000 foot level, flight level, then what's the kind of value stream, like the flow of value across those teams at a high level. So what is that high level narrative of, let's say it's an ordering process that these teams are working on? Because typically each team is working on part of the process.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Is like there's little processes that expand and then turn into this larger one, and it's kind of that handoff, right? Right.
There's often handoffs. There's often teams working in somewhat of a siloed kind of approach, which isn't bad. It's just the way it is. And so there's often not an awareness of how what a particular team does impacts the overall value stream. And so at that level, we would do a sequence of what's the high level story through this, and then from there identify what would be pivotal events in that story. So often a clue for a pivotal event is some kind of handoff. So an example might be going through the first part of the process, and then where you are trying to sign on new clients to join your ordering process, and you get a contract signed event. And from prior to that, then it would be more like a sales process. And then once you hit contract signed, it probably switches over into onboarding. And then when the onboarding is completed, then you're probably now in more of an operational kind of state. And so identifying what are those pivotal events, and then labeling the sub-processes, looking for emergent structure around those. Those pivotal events often indicate team or potential team or system boundaries. So I've done this kind of exercise with teams that are working in a monolithic application and are trying to identify potential boundaries. So looking for handoffs or shifts in language across that process is critical. We usually map out actors and systems. So like API calls or calls to services that might be owned by other teams. We would typically map out value. Where is value being generated in that process? And then identify like where are pain points in the process and opportunities for improvement. And then from there, based on the opportunities, then it's like, okay, what do we do next? Like, where are the problem areas or the areas where there's a real opportunity to do some innovative work, and what might we need to do next to get teams aligned around those types of things. So that it'll often start with this big picture kind of set of, if it's virtual, it'll be a set of sessions for modeling it out on a Miro board or a mural board or something like that, or in person if people are in person. And we want business people there as well, right? Experts from the business side that can weigh in on the actual process. And so it helps the teams see where they fit. It also helps them see how what they does might impact people downstream from them in the process. And also what I tend to find, which is kind of funny to me, is that teams will often have problems that are caused upstream from them, right? So they may spend a lot of time validating and fixing data because it's not being, like it could be easily addressed further up in the value stream by another team that's actually doing the configuration of the data. But because it's not sort of addressed upstream, they have to then deal with the complexity of what they're being handed. So it exposes those types of things as well, where, you know, the complexity might be something that's actually flowing down the process from other systems or teams that are further up in the process. I'm getting in the weeds here a bit.
I think it's good to give these examples, because it's people will probably relate to it, for sure. Like right when you started mentioning, I'm like, yeah, absolutely.
I remember an example from Matt Wynn years ago. He talked about, you know, you might end up with a team that they feel like most of their job is that they just keep getting handed burnt toast, and so most of their job is to scrape the toast. Yeah. You know, and so the real thing you need to do is actually like fix the burning of the toast that's further up, right? So it can identify those types of things, which can make a huge difference to how you model a domain, right? And what your software needs to do. One thing I want to mention is people that are interested in the learning more about event storming. I have a book out on LeanPub called the EventStorming Handbook that is very close to being finished in terms of helping. It's really designed in 100 pages or less to help somebody go from not knowing anything about event storming to actually being able to facilitate the types of things that I'm talking about here. So I'm trying to, in that book, take everything I've learned from other people and learn through my own mistakes and distill it down into some kind of easily digestible handbook that somebody could take and work with if they would find that helpful.
I really appreciate Paul taking the time, having this conversation. Make sure you check out the Explore DDD Conference and his ebook on event storming. Both the links are in the description. If you want to chat with other software developers about topics like this, you can get access to my private Discord server if you join my channel. The link's in the description on how to join. If you enjoyed this type of video where I had somebody else on, let me know in the comments. Make a suggestion on who you'd like me to reach out to and possibly have a conversation with. If you enjoyed this video though, give it a thumbs up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, make sure to leave a comment. And please subscribe for more videos on software architecture and design. Thanks.